If ever there was an area of business where the human capital is paramount, it's in sales. We went through this in our previous discussion, but this notion that somehow it's a digital eats physical world is simply unsupported by the data. Sales remains, even in an omni-channel buying world, it remains a people-first sort of activity. That doesn't mean the digital tools are not relevant, are not changing buying processes dramatically, can help you with training and coaching and development. But at the end of the day, the vast majority of purchases are still people buying from people. So, this is just built in to us as social creatures, and it's fundamentally what the sales function in any business is about.
Hi, friends. Welcome to the Sales Enablement Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Paul. That was Frank Cespedes. Frank is a senior lecturer at the Harvard Business School and is the author of several books on sales, including his latest one, Sales Management That Works: How to Sell in a World That Never Stops Changing. It's always an educational conversation, for me at least, when I have a chance to talk with Frank, and today's no exception. We start by talking about the looming threat of recession and what that is going to mean for companies and their sales teams that have embraced the growth at all costs model. We talk about the threat to those companies that have over-indexed on a volume approach to business development and selling, especially low win rate SaaS companies, and we dive into the challenges they're going to face as the economy slows down. Challenges including learning how to execute a process that enables them to compete and win a much higher fraction of the opportunities in their pipeline. We also dive into a discussion on Frank's favorite chapter from my new book, Sell Without Selling Out. That's the chapter titled, Are You a Sales Leader or Merely a Sales Boss? And we get into some of the differences between being a sales leader and being merely just a boss. We get into all this and much, much more. But before we get to Frank, I want to remind you to subscribe to this podcast, Sales Enablement with Andy Paul, wherever you listen to podcasts. I also urge you to check out my latest book, Sell Without Selling Out. It's a modern, human-centric framework for increasing your win rates and shortening your decision cycles without resorting to the salesy behaviors that buyers dislike. It's available everywhere you shop for books, online, and in stores. Okay, let's jump into it. Frank, welcome back to the show.
Andy, my pleasure. Thank you very, very much for inviting me back.
Yeah, you're interrupting your vacation. It sounds like you're out in Western Massachusetts.
Look, Andy, you know this. I am a professor once again. Life is an interruption of the vacation. It's not so bad.
True. So, so for people that haven't heard you on the show, you've been on a couple times before. Tell us about yourself and what you do.
Well, again, my background is just not that exotic. I don't want to pretend that it is. I was an academic at Harvard's Business School for about 11 years, made my way up the hierarchy. Then I left with some others. We started a business. I ran that for 10 years, and we got lucky. When necessary, I can always spin this a different way. But it was dumb luck. We sold at exactly the right time. Harvard called me back up, said, how'd you like to be a professor? And Andy, after you've made some money, being a professor is a good life. Never feel sorry for me.
A good gig. Right. Yeah, well, I take it you came back in, you're probably not tenure track at that point, so you're just focusing on teaching and so on.
Well, teaching and writing, which is the reason I became an academic in the first place,
Sure.
It's a good thing.
Yeah. Well, last time you were on, we talked about your book, which is a great book, Sales Management That Works, and definitely a book listeners should read.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for that. And I certainly hope they do.
Yeah. It's one of the things I enjoyed about it was just a fresh perspective on on sales management that's so desperately needed at this time. So, one things I wanted to chat about at the beginning here is, and you and I touched on this before we started recording, is the coming or looming recession, if you will. And, so many companies, certainly the tech space, bought into this growth at all cost model.
Yeah.
And as you and I have talked about, many of them never really learned how to sell. What do you think is going to happen?
Well, I mean, you know the old saying, predictions are risky, especially about the future, right? The predictions about the past.
Niels Bohr,
are the easy ones. And I don't know that much more than economists do, but I don't mean to brag when I say that because they're not particularly good at forecasting these things. But my take is that you're raising the right issue. I do think that the central banks around the world, their timing has not been good. I think the odds of a recession are high, and in fact, it may be worse than that. It may be what 30 years ago we called stagflation, both inflation and a recession. And I think there are a couple of implications for that. Especially for tech firms, but not only for tech firms, I think for sellers and sales managers. But let me start with tech firms. The reality is for over a decade, for about 13 years or so, we've had negative real interest rates. A VC said this to me a couple of years ago, and I think he was exactly right. He said, it's never been easier, at least in the United States, never been easier to start a business and never harder to scale it. Now I think both things become harder because the money is no longer free. And it's very difficult to do what a number of tech firms have done, go public, when you haven't made a single dime of profit yet. I think those days are fast disappearing. And so one of the implications is, how do you make money? This is where you and I live. I think you and I worship in the same church this way, Andy. I don't really care whether we call it sales, marketing, or asparagus. Profitable business development becomes more important. Then we get to the issue of inflation and a possible recession at the same time. With inflation, I think lots of people talk about raising prices. My experience with that, both in the firm I ran and, observing this 30 years ago, that's actually the easier part. I do think one of the issues, though, is to think about where pricing authority resides in the company. Because when you look at comp systems and sales, most salespeople have a big incentive when you're in an inflationary environment to say, listen, let's keep our price, don't raise it, then we can do more. I think you've got to think about the manager having more control over pricing. But the big issue is what it does to the rest of the business model. And as you know from our previous conversations about my book, that's one of the things I talk about there. Sales is increasingly, for lots of reasons that are not going away, increasingly a cross-functional activity. So selling is more intimately connected now with those other areas that inflation makes more difficult. Then when it comes to recession, the basics apply. If you cannot articulate your value proposition and the outcomes crisply and to the point, you're not well prepared for a recession. That basic in sales becomes even more important when budgets at clients inevitably tighten.
Yeah, I think that's really where the the real problem is going to exist. Is that I look at the tech space and people I talk to on the show and other parts of my work is they're operating on relatively, you and I talked about this, relatively low win rates based on the number of opportunities they're working on. And so sales execution is, as you and I know it, is not a priority. They're content to focus more on top of funnel and just sort of taking a percentage off of that and being happy with that percentage. But when activity levels or the potential for what happens at the top of the funnel starts to contract or stay static, you can't improve how you execute, then you're in real trouble.
Yeah, yeah, but I think that that change will happen, and it will happen in a hurry. I think the investors will get it. That's my experience sitting on boards, working with VC firms. I think the people running sales have to be prepared for that. There's a difference between simply going for volume and going for profitable value. There's a big difference there.
Mm-hmm. Well, so if they've been operating in this, the first mode about growth at all costs, volume oriented, how do they reorient themselves to execution? Because I think that part of it is not just, hey, here's a change of tact for us, but I think they've staffed themselves and trained themselves for the growth at all costs, and they may not have compatible resources.
Yeah. My take on this is that there are three dimensions to doing that, to that pivot that the external environment is very likely to require. The first one is fundamentally a strategic issue. Do we know who our target customers are and are not? What in sales we
Right.
call customer selection, what the strategy people in their jargon call scope, the scope of the business, where we play and where we don't play. And here I think sales has got to be more rigorous about that, because when you look at that model that you and I have been talking about, don't worry about it, grow big fast. In that model, generally speaking, there is no such thing as a bad customer. But stagflation, or whatever you want to call it, does create bad customers. False positives
Yes.
are increasingly expensive in an environment like that. Then the next issue is a management issue, sales management. Here I'm going to return a compliment to you, your new book, which I think is excellent. Your
Well,
distinction,
thank you.
which I think you get very specific about, between a sales boss and a sales leader becomes more important. And the characteristics, the behavioral characteristics that you attribute to sales leaders, do they understand their people? Do they coach them? Do they develop the requisite capabilities? Those things become important. Managers must manage in that sense. And then the third thing I'll say, and this is part of what you quite rightly talk about as well as I do in my book, and this sounds humble, but throughout my career, it's astounding to me how many sales managers ignore this. The importance of performance reviews, performance evaluation, and development. So much of the important information required for customer selection, required to develop the capabilities of salespeople, does not reside in the CRM system. It resides in the skulls of the individual account managers, etc. And you only get at that, you only make it visible and actionable when you do good performance reviews and coaching. And when managers don't do that in any environment, but especially the one we're talking about, they not only perpetuate a culture of underperformance, they inhibit the flow of vital information, especially when inflationary pressures combined with potential recessionary pressures are essentially what's affecting your customers. So those would be the three things, that I would outline.
Well, I mean, those are, yeah, those are right at the heart of things. I mean, I think that, you talk about, coaching is, as you think about it, is right now there's a huge perception gap between the amount of coaching that sellers report they receive versus the amount that sales managers say they're giving. And if we assume that it's probably more correct, the figure on the part of the sellers, the excuse is always given is that too busy, right? I'm too busy managing the metrics and reporting and so on. it seems like for a sales leader that going to take a certain amount of gumption, courage, if you will, to be able to push back in this environment and say, yeah, no, we need to make a change. We have to do these things that you describe. But at the same time, they're feeling this pressure. Is that average tenure for, at least in the tech world, for CROs like less than 18 months these days. It's like they don't feel, I think, like they have the latitude or the time to make substantive changes.
Yeah, but I would. I think, yeah, it takes gumption, but I think it's always, and this is, I like to quote the gangster movies. And what I say to sales managers when they say exactly what you said, which is obviously where they live, I always say the same thing. Remember, you chose this life. All right. That's the line I take from the gangster movies.
Right.
And I think it's important
Right.
to recognize a few things. One is the nature of the life. All right. And this is not just for sales managers. It's important for their investors to understand, the CEO, etc. Change is always especially difficult in sales for systemic reasons. The major one is that so many other resource allocations in the business depend on sales forecasts and the ability of the sales force to meet those forecasts. And that's why in sales we have these metrics that focus on what are you doing by month, by quarter, annually, etc. When the metrics reinforce that, salespeople focus on that. And the danger is that even when the market changes, they stick with the devil they know, right? They avoid the
Right.
transition costs. Well, that's how companies
Right.
get disrupted. That's how you fail. The second thing is the issue about I'm too busy to do coaching performance reviews with my people. And again, the question I always ask is too busy versus what? What's the alternative use of time? And here I think it's important to understand cause and effect. It's people performance that drives financial performance, not the other way around, even though most companies do their strategic planning bass backwards, right? They start
Right.
with the numbers and then they say, oh, yeah, let's
Yep.
not forget about people. Performance in the field is people, then the numbers. And, if you can come up with a lot more things you can do that are more valuable than incrementally increasing the productivity of your salespeople, let me know. But I rarely see that. So I think the I'm too busy rationalization is a rationalization, and salespeople want the feedback. They want it, and they
Yeah.
don't, not because they're learning mavens, but because they want to make more money next month, next quarter, next year. So I think this one I put on the managers.
Oh, I agree. Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think you're right. It's a rationalization for doing something for avoiding doing something that they're
Yeah,
just, they're not trained to do for the most part, and thus they feel uncomfortable
yeah.
or
But
perhaps
the
less than
let me let
competent even
me
doing
add
it.
let me add one other thing to that, because this is something I see, and I'd be interested to compare notes with you, Andy. But
Sure.
something that I see happening big time in the last 6 to 12 months because of the current state of the labor markets, and that is the hiring
Hmm.
there. We need
Right.
people who has a pulse, that kind of thing.
Right.
It's no
Right.
coincidence that one of the oldest aphorisms in sales is remember, you hired your problems.
Mm.
Hiring and performance development are intimately linked. We don't like to say this, it's become politically incorrect. But the reality is, it's just damn tough to develop someone who's a bad fit for the job in the first place.
Right.
So,
Correct.
it's not only the performance reviews in sales, usually it's that manager who's got the most influence on hiring, and they need to exercise that influence.
And I think to some degree, I again put the blame more on the manager as well in this regard, in that they're not being rigorous enough, to use the term you used before, in terms of defining what they need from the people that they're hiring.
Yeah.
And yeah, I was having a conversation with a sales leader a month or so ago, and they were, looking for people, desperately looking for people, and they'd, put together their job definition and description of what the person needed to have relative to experience and skills. And I asked the question, I said, so have you ever asked one of your customers or buyers what they need from your salespeople
Great
in
comment.
order to help them get their job done? And it was just this blank stare, like, what planet are you from?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great comment, for two reasons. One is, you've heard me say this before, um, and I know you agree from your book. Most important thing about selling is the buyer, right? Who buys,
Mm-hmm.
why, and how. Those are the tasks. Those are the capabilities you're looking for. And to your point, my experience over the years when I ask the hiring managers in sales, what are you looking for? I tend to get back a kind of long checklist of capabilities that only Michelangelo or Michael Jordan could fulfill, right? Some
Right.
Renaissance man or woman. And I always say the same thing. When you can hire Michelangelo or Michael Jordan, do it. I'm sure they're going to add value. But there are not that many, omni capable people out there. How we've got
Right.
levers under our control that we can specify and make the average person better because it's a better fit with what we're asking them to do. So I'm with you 100% on that.
Yeah, I think fit, even from the individual being hired, I don't think they think enough about fit. I mean, there's a lot of thought leadership taking place about how to earn seven figures, right? And some of it's good, but part of the problem is, I tell people, is I get people contact me about this, is as an individual, your odds of succeeding are really based first and foremost upon the fit.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But I think that as usual, there's both a supply and a demand side to this.
Mm,
On the supply side, and that is the salesperson. And I think both our lives are good examples of this. You come right out of school. What do you know? You've got to land in a couple of
nothing.
airports first. So I think that search process for fit is legitimate, understandable, and that's a big part of what you do as a young salesperson. You do learn the kind of sales tasks that you're not only good at, but that you enjoy, that you fulfill you,
Right.
and that allow you to execute on what you call those four C's, right?
Right.
Curiosity, etc. On the other side,
Yep.
the people doing the hiring, however, and again, my book goes through the research about this, and the research about this, I think, is as close to definitive as anything you'll ever read in a management book.
Mm-hmm.
The ability of managers to predict fit on the basis of a few interviews is less than zero point 0.5, less than the 50-50 rate of flipping a coin.
Right.
Selling is
Yeah.
about behaviors. It's not about how they smile in the interview. And the only way to get at behaviors is to observe it, right? There are assessments you can now do. There are online gaming like technologies that are useful. And there are internship hiring scenarios that you can put in place. And when you do that, you can actually put together packages, comp packages that are very attractive and give you a leg up in a tough
Mm-hmm.
hiring world. So all of those things can be done to sort of get better at fit for both the buyer and the seller in the hiring market.
Yeah, I mean, I really like the idea and encourage people to that you talk about sort of the intern, paid intern, apprentice, maybe even role. I mean, I don't know. When I got started in sales was considered much more of an apprenticeship
Yeah,
than today. I mean, we onboarded, but no one was gonna fire us in 90 days if we, weren't performing up to a certain level. Because the expectation was, heck, they didn't even send me to for training, or not me, but people at that time when we were hired, they staged it. We didn't even get sent to the training for what we were ultimately hired to do until we had been there 6 months.
Yeah. Well,
And in the meantime, we were out selling.
I'm going to run the risk of sounding like, the typical Harvard professor. On the one hand, this, on the other hand, that. But I agree with you. And then I'm going to disagree a bit. First, I do agree with you that things have changed. All this talk in the last 15, 20 years about the science of selling. Sales is very context specific. It is not a science.
Right.
Science, for me, is if we do X, Y, and Z, we can get that man or woman to the moon and back safely. That is just not the way sales works in the vast majority of markets. But there's been a lot of rhetoric about that as opposed to what is still a performance art. That's what selling is. But the other thing is this is not specific to sales. I have worked with lots and lots of companies. I sit on boards, and you'll see this in the studies about people's careers. You ask people, tell me about your career. What made you successful? And by far the most common response one gets is, I was lucky. I was lucky. It just so happened that when I was at XYZ, there was this older guy or gal, and they may never have used the word mentor, but they did mentor me. That is, in fact, what an apprenticeship is about. And it's built into most business careers. Nobody in an interview, even your future boss, can really explain to you what it's like to work in an organization. You got to be there. It's an existential issue, as we say.
Right. Yeah, no, it's such a great point. I mean, first of all, I love the point about luck, right? I mean, yeah, I think on one hand, I'm pretty good at what I do. But on the other hand, I happen to be at certain companies at the right time. We had sort of the right mix of product and circumstances that, if I'd been there at a different time, wouldn't have had them.
Yeah.
But people are loath to talk about the role of luck in sales. I think that it plays a big role a really big role in sales.
Well, that's one of the best pieces of advice that I've ever heard for younger people. There's a case I teach in the MBA course I started, and the entrepreneur is basically our age. He's, in fact, he's probably a bit older. But if you look at his career, he graduated from Harvard Business School, I think, about 1980. If you look at his career, it's the kind of career that most young business school students say they want. I'm going to do X, then I'm going to do Y, then I'm going to be a serial entrepreneur. I'm going to make money. And I always ask him at the end of the case discussion, after he's explained to us what happened with his latest venture, I said, most of these people want to live your life, Paul. What would be your advice? And his answer is very good. He said, he prefaces it by saying, I got lucky. He said, when I left business school, 1981 or whatever it was, I joined a small company, in what was then called the cell phone industry. This is back when cell phones, were, the size of our bodies or something.
Right.
And he said the firm didn't succeed, but I got in on the ground floor of a space that only grew dramatically over the next decade. And that's always his advice to the young students. Start with a space that you're pretty sure is going to be big, because lots of other opportunities open up, and that's how you make your own luck. I think it's good advice.
I think it's very good advice. Well, and it's interesting you bring it up, because I was having a conversation with somebody yesterday actually about the virtue of patience in sales, and the rate at which people are switching jobs, irrespective of this great reshuffling that's going on now. But even prior to that, you saw the you saw this is this trend is, yeah, they're switching job to job. Oftentimes, different segments. You're not giving yourself the benefit of actually learning something and building on that. As you talked about, this example for this entrepreneur.
Yeah. Well, but again, I think it depends what the nature of the switching is. I mean, what I do think, and this has been gone for years and years and years. When you and I started out, there was still a notion, it was declining, but there was still a notion, pick a great company and stick with it for 20, 30 years. Those days are gone. That genie's out of the bottle. You're not going to put it back. By the way, this relates to our earlier topic today. This is why sales managers in particular need to focus on what you call being a sales leader, not a sales boss. You've got to be worthy of that talent because it comes and it goes.
Yep.
You want to be the talent magnet. Now, when people switch, and this is what I see going on, and what's the jargon? We now call it the great resignation. And if you look at the data, a lot of that was simply people taking early retirement. I mean, that was essentially what a lot of it was. But if you're switching, let's say from sales job A to sales job, you've been an SDR, now you're going to be account executive at a different tech firm. I'd argue that that's somebody who's still managing their professional development and not somebody who's just chasing the next higher number. And then there are others that have legitimately decided this is not for me. I don't want to do this. I'm going to do something else. And then there are what I'll call the facile switchers. But you know this. Humanity comes in all shapes and sizes. Always has.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. And the last group are the people that are chasing the brass ring. So, so I'm sorry. I was checking the header. I'll catch this. I was checking to see if you're still there. Let's jump into not be too self-serving, but one of the things we didn't talk about was that section in my book about are you a sales leader or merely a sales boss? Because I think it's relevant to what we've been talking about. Certainly in these days where there's the growth at all costs mode that many companies operate in. For me, I sort of started saying, look, bosses focus more on process than on people. And this is, I think you had specifically talked about that before, is that this is still, despite what people think it's a science, that it's still a performance art. And I agree with that.
Yeah. And if ever there was an area of business where the human capital is paramount, it's in sales. I mean, we went through this in our previous discussion, but this notion that somehow it's a digital eats physical world is simply unsupported by the data. Sales remains, even in an omni-channel buying world, it remains a people first sort of activity. That doesn't mean the digital tools are not relevant, are not changing buying processes dramatically, can help you with training and coaching and development. But at the end of the day, the vast majority of purchases are still people buying from people. So, this is just built in to us as social creatures, and it's fundamentally what the sales function in any business is about.
Yeah, and I think that one of the issues has been is that with the advancement of so many interesting sales technologies, is that there have been a cohort of sales managers with a certain level of experience and expertise that thought that you could reduce the relevance or the need for the human in that the process and the technology could take over much of the function of that. And I think in part because they were also sort of uncomfortable with with the whole human aspect of it themselves.
Yeah. No, I think you're right on both counts. But again, I don't want to just blame sales managers. I remember I wrote a case study at Harvard years ago, and one of the executives I interviewed said something that it took me a while to understand the wisdom of what he was getting at. He said, Frank, you watch what you're going to see in your career. Most companies maintain their equipment better than they do their people, right? And I think he was exactly right
Great
about that.
point.
And ultimately, you get what you don't maintain. All right, that's comment number one in it. But I don't think that's just sales managers. I think that's managers in general. And again, it becomes more important when when you're dealing in an environment where selling itself becomes tougher, either because of price or budget
Hmm.
pressures and so on. And then I do think, and this I do think is something we see in the tech sector. I don't want to say this is common. That would be an illegitimate exaggeration. But there are certain people, especially in tech, who essentially their attitude is, I don't do people. I don't do emotion. I don't do this. Well, I'm sorry. You chose this life. Business
Yeah,
is a human
I remember
activity.
that
It's
statement, by the
not
way.
a machine to machine activity.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so let me ask you a question, because you sit on a number of boards, and to me, it seems like one of the problems that exist from a cultural standpoint in terms of how sales is enabled, how sellers are developed, the resources devoted to it, starts right at the top, and that I think frontline sales managers are sort of stranded on an island, especially newer ones get promoted, have sort of just a modicum of sales experience themselves, and then they don't get the resources and the training and the coaching they need to be able to help their people. And it just sort of seems that at the top, someone's saying it's good enough what we're doing.
Well,
And
I
and
mean,
there've been other
yeah,
performance related fields that have had real revolution. I mean, you just take professional sports as one I like to talk about. Is real revolution in the way that they've developed specialized coaches and specialized technology to really help improve performance, and both
yeah,
from a mental and a physical standpoint. And we see
yeah.
almost nothing similar in sales.
Well, I see a couple of things going on. Um, and I think it's changing the situation that, frankly, you've, I think, historically described very aptly. A couple of things. One is there is a sustained data revolution going on in business. This will continue
Mm-hmm.
throughout our lifetimes. And what I see going on, I see this in boards, I see this with companies I work with, that data gets funneled up increasingly, not through the CRO, but through the finance function. And again, Andy, you know this finance people are annoying. They are very annoying people. Once they get data, they start to ask questions. How do you,
Right.
sales vice president, spend all this money? Yeah, I understand the story you're giving me about top line volume, but the way we accrete enterprise value here is in terms of return on invested capital. Do you know your
Mm-hmm.
cost to serve, selling cycle by segment? The requirements for financial literacy in sales as a result of that are increasing dramatically. So that's one change.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing, however, is there is a growing gap between senior executives and the sales force in many companies. I mean, this is documented in my book and the studies that I cite there. But one of the lesser well-known dirty secrets of companies in the last 25 years, a colleague of mine did great research about this. In the last 25 years, a number of people reporting to the CEO in the global 1200 on average has doubled, twice as many. But then if you ask yourself, who are these people? What were they doing before they became senior executives? the majority of those people were not general managers in the sense in which I think you and I would use that phrase. By a GM,
Hmm.
we usually mean
Right.
someone running a line of business or someone with P&L
Right.
responsibility. They tended
Right.
to be specialists, the CIO, the CMO, the head of data, whatever. And reason for that is business is more complex. But the ironic result of that in many companies is that the C suite itself is increasingly siloed among specialists. Ironically, it looks like a faculty meeting at Harvard, that sort of thing. And B, fewer people than ever before have made it to the top with prolonged prior experience in customer facing functions like sales and marketing. That's
Right.
a big deal. The
Got
job
it.
of a senior executive
Yep.
is not to run the sales force, but it is to know the right questions to ask about their sales models. And many don't. And at the same time, the data is making the finance people quite rightly pound on sales managers for value accretion, not only the top line. And I think getting back to what we talked about originally, if there's a recession and sustained inflation, that trend is only going to increase.
Mm. So,
The
okay.
bottom line here,
If
Andy, is that you and I were in sales at the right time. It was easier.
well, as we talked about, let's see, I sold through 4 recessions or,
Yeah.
or severe disruptions in the economy so far. But it is about execution, right? I mean,
Yeah.
for me, that's always been the bottom line and I think we got away from this emphasis on executing to the extent that we could, and got sloppy and lazy because of the sort of seduction of volume. But we're going to come back to a time where execution is going to be at a premium again.
Yeah, or we redefined execution as, I don't know, number of clicks, number of this, number of that, as
Uh,
opposed to the outcomes. Because again, sales in
right.
business is a performance art. It's about,
Yeah.
how many of our listeners who run sales forces, this has been true in every sales organization I've always worked with, those people who do everything right except the most important thing, which is to close the sale. So, that is increasingly important in the environment we're talking about. And
Yeah.
that's something people do,
Yeah. No, I think,
not machines.
yeah. And it's going to be really interesting to see over the next 6 months to a year exactly how people adapt, because there's going to be a lot of adaptation that takes place among companies that are in that growth at all cost mode. It's
Yeah.
going to be a new reality.
But as always, some figure it out, some don't. That's the glory of capitalism. The bar,
Yep.
when I say this, people say duh, but then they think about it and get it. In business, you do not compete with businesses that have gone out of business. You only compete with the survivors. And to survive, you got to adapt. You got to get better. The bar is always rising, but that's good. That's part of why capitalism is a good thing socially as well as economically.
Right. Right. I agree. All right. Well, Frank, with that, let's wrap it up. So thank you for joining me.
Andy, as always, absolute pleasure to converse with you. Thank you. Thank you for hosting me.
Yeah. Well, no, we'll make sure we do it again before too long. And if people want to connect with you, what's the best way to do that?
There's the book you mentioned. It's called Sales Management That Works: How to Sell in a World That Never Stops Changing. It's published Harvard Business Review Press. You can go to their website. You can go to Amazon, Goodreads, all of those. And in all those places, there's a way to communicate. And I also have a website, frankcespedes.com. Although I must confess, I can't remember the last time I actually went to the website, but it automatically, any messages left there automatically get into my email. And then there is the
All right.
all-purpose LinkedIn.
LinkedIn, all purpose. It's funny. Just on the show over the course of the last 7 years, yeah, I sort of look at the trends of how people answer the question about where do you find me, and It's changed dramatically. Yeah, everybody leads with LinkedIn almost. So,
Yeah,
well,
but
good. Well, Frank,
they deserve our credit. They've done a wonderful job developing their business and
oh
what
yeah,
they've done. I admire them.
and me too. And it is where business happens,
Yeah,
and yeah, yeah, increasingly. And so, I mean, even in my business, I mean, it's yeah. I used to when I sort of got down this path of writing books and quote unquote thought leadership is all about your blog and your email list, and it's like no, it's all about LinkedIn today. So,
but
all
again,
right,
Andy,
Frank, thank you
thank
so
you very
much.
much.
Okay, friends, that's it for this episode. First of all, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen. I am so grateful for your support of this show. And I want to thank my guest, Frank Cespedes, for sharing his insights with us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast, Sales Enablement with Andy Paul, on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And again, thank you so much for investing your time with me today. Until next time, I'm your host, Andy Paul. Good selling, everyone.